My ninth grade English teacher used audio torture to trigger my Tourette's and gave me a concussion. She told me I'd never amount to anything, so I gathered evidence and destroyed her career in the most satisfying way. When Ms. Taylor leaned in and whispered, "You'll never amount to anything." She was my ninth grade English teacher, and she loved to use my Tourette's to make me feel like I didn't belong. I was diagnosed at age 10, and I'd spent my whole childhood trying to keep my diagnosis hidden, just so I could feel like a normal kid with friends. I had always done a good job at it, but when high school started, my mom forced me to tell all my teachers in case there was an emergency. That was the start of it all. Other teachers didn't mind, but when I told Ms. Taylor, she burst out laughing. "Want my advice, kid? You should focus less on following trends and more on studying." I stared at her blankly. She continued, "Welcome to the real world. Not everyone's gonna give an F about your quirks." I felt my face burning up with embarrassment, so I just nodded my head until she finally stopped talking. I went home that day crying my eyes out, and my mom held me. She promised to go to school administration and have her fired. The next morning, we sat in front of the principal and explained everything. He had a white beard, beady eyes, and a Nokia phone. When we were finished, he started banging his fist on the desk. "You really expect me to get mad over this?" he exclaimed while laughing like a pig. "Get the F out of my office. You need to learn to grow a pair." And maybe if my mom could afford a lawyer, we would have been able to sue, but we couldn't. So instead, I lied to her. I went home that day and told my mom that Ms. Taylor had a change of heart, and my mom pretended to believe me. It was easier that way, because the truth is, English became my least favorite class of all time. Ms. Taylor took every opportunity to scrutinize me. If my shoulder jerked during a test, she'd stare at me and say, "Stop embarrassing yourself." If I made a clicking sound while she was in the middle of teaching, she'd completely stop the lesson and bury her face in her hands for 5 minutes straight. And, unlike autism, tics are almost impossible to mask. As soon as I get the urge to do something like bark like a dog, I feel a painful knot in my stomach getting tighter and tighter like a rope around my neck. But because of Ms. Taylor, I started suppressing harder than I ever had before. By the end of each day, my whole body ached from holding everything in. I couldn't even sit through a class without collapsing onto the desk and falling asleep. I just wanted to prove that I was strong. Then, one day, things went completely sideways. It was the middle of a test, and I'd spent the last 20 minutes desperately trying to suppress a tic that felt like a firecracker building in my chest. My whole body was shaking, sweat dripping down my forehead, and I was gripping the edge of my desk like it was the only thing keeping me alive. Ms. Taylor noticed immediately. She stood up and marched over, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. She bent down, leaned in way too close, and whispered just loud enough for everyone to hear, "This is exactly why you'll never amount to anything." That was it, I snapped. Before I even realized what was happening, my tic erupted, loud and uncontrollable. Fuck, bitch, shit, batch, what, fuck. Kids around me either burst into laughter or stared in shock, their eyes wide with secondhand embarrassment. But to my surprise, Ms. Taylor didn't yell at me. In fact, she didn't say anything. She took out a pair of headphones from behind her desk, gesturing for me to play the sensory music that helps me regulate. Something felt off, but I just wanted my tics to end. But the second I put them on, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. Because what played wasn't the steady rhythms I needed. It was chaos, sudden shrieking noises and irregular beats. It felt like someone was scraping my bones with their nails. My body reacted instantly. Every tic I'd been suppressing exploded out at once. My arms jerked violently, and my head snapped back, and these loud vocal tics I'd never even had before ripped out of my throat. I tried to pull the earbuds out, but my hands were jerking too badly to grab them. The class was completely silent in shock, except for Ms. Taylor, who was laughing and shrieking about how good my performance was. The rest of the day was a blur, and next thing I knew, I was waking up in the hospital surrounded by nurses. Turns out, I had banged my skull against the wall so hard that I'd given myself a concussion. I woke up to my mom in tears. She told me that Ms. Taylor admitted to playing sounds specifically designed to trigger tics, because she wanted to prove it was something I could get over. And while I reassured my mom that I was okay, rage boiled my blood. I knew I had to make Ms. Taylor pay. I sat up in the hospital bed, my hands still trembling from the aftershocks of what happened. Mom squeezed my shoulder, her eyes red and puffy from crying. The nurses checked my vitals one more time before leaving us alone in the sterile white room. "We're filing a formal complaint first thing tomorrow," Mom said, her voice shaking with barely contained fury. "This ends now," I nodded, touching the bandage wrapped around my head. The throbbing pain reminded me of how hard I'd hit that wall. Ms. Taylor's laughter still echoed in my ears. The next morning, we drove straight to the district office. Mom had stayed up all night preparing documentation, printing out emails, and organizing medical records. She carried a thick folder under her arm as we walked through the glass doors. The district superintendent, Mr. McVictoria, greeted us with a firm handshake. His office smelled like coffee and old leather chairs. We sat down, and Mom spread out the papers across his mahogany desk. "This is completely unacceptable," Mom began, her voice steady now. "A teacher deliberately triggered my child's medical condition, resulting in hospitalization." Mr. McVictoria adjusted his glasses, scanning through the documents. His expression remained neutral as Mom recounted everything, from Ms. Taylor's first cruel comment to the headphone incident that landed me in the hospital. "I understand your concerns," he said finally, folding his hands on the desk. "However, Ms. Taylor is a valued teacher with over 15 years of tenure. Are you certain this wasn't simply a misunderstanding?" My stomach dropped. Mom's face flushed red. "A misunderstanding?" she repeated. "My child has a concussion. The teacher admitted to playing triggering sounds on purpose." Mr. McVictoria shifted in his chair. "I'll look into it, but without concrete evidence beyond your word against hers, there's limited action we can take." We left the office feeling defeated. Mom gripped the steering wheel so tight her knuckles turned white. I stared out the window, watching the school buildings blur past. 2 days later, I returned to school with a doctor's note. My head still ached, but I couldn't afford to miss more classes. During lunch, I sat alone in the cafeteria when someone slid into the seat across from me. "Hey," a soft voice said. I looked up to see Mrs. McBenjamin, the school counselor. She had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "I heard about what happened. How are you feeling?" I shrugged, poking at my sandwich. "Been better." She leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "Can I tell you something in confidence?" When I nodded, she continued, "You're not the first student who's had issues with Ms. Taylor. There have been other complaints over the years." My head snapped up. "Really? What happened to them?" Mrs. McBenjamin glanced around nervously. "The complaints. They disappeared from the records. Students transferred schools, parents gave up. But I remember them." She slipped me a piece of paper with 3 names written on it. "These former students might be willing to talk to you, but be careful. Ms. Taylor has more influence than you might think." I tucked the paper into my pocket, my mind racing. If there were others, maybe we could build a stronger case. That afternoon, I had English class. My stomach churned as I walked through the door. Ms. Taylor stood at the front, writing on the board like nothing had happened. When she saw me, her lips curled into a smile. "Welcome back," she said sweetly. "I hope you're feeling better." I took my seat without responding. Throughout the class, I kept my phone hidden under my desk, recording audio. Every snide comment, every subtle jab, I captured it all. Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed with gathering evidence. I recorded her mocking another student's stutter. I caught her making fun of a kid with dyslexia. Each recording went into a folder on my laptop labeled evidence. But Ms. Taylor wasn't stupid. She noticed me positioning my phone, saw me typing notes after her comments. Her behavior toward me shifted from openly cruel to cunningly subtle. My essay on Shakespeare came back with a D-, even though I'd spent hours perfecting it. When I compared answers with my friend Alex, I realized she'd marked correct interpretations as wrong. My homework started going missing from her desk. Pop quizzes appeared whenever I walked in late from a tic episode. "Your grades are slipping," she announced one day, loud enough for the whole class to hear. Maybe you should focus less on your phone and more on your studies. The other students shifted uncomfortably. They'd all seen what happened with the headphones. Nobody wanted to be her next target. That evening, Mom noticed my report card. English had dropped from a B+ to a D. What's going on? She asked, frowning at the paper. I explained about the missing assignments and wrongly marked tests. Mom's jaw tightened. I'm going to talk to her directly, she declared. Mom, no, I pleaded. It'll just make things worse. But Mom had already grabbed her car keys. I followed her to school, anxiety twisting my stomach into knots. We found Ms. Taylor in her classroom, grading papers. She looked up with that fake smile. Mrs. Patterson, what a surprise. How can I help you? Mom didn't waste time with pleasantries. You're deliberately sabotaging my child's grades. This needs to stop immediately. Ms. Taylor's expression hardened. She stood up slowly, walking around her desk. Your child is struggling because they're distracted and disruptive. Perhaps if they focused more on academics instead of playing with their phone. Don't you dare, Mom interrupted. I know what you're doing. Ms. Taylor's smile turned cold. Do you? Because what I see is a student who can't handle the rigors of high school. If this continues, they'll fail my class. No college will accept them with an F in English. Is that what you want? The threat hung in the air like poison. Mom's face went pale. We both knew she was right. One failed class could derail my entire future. We left without another word. In the car, Mom gripped my hand. We'll figure this out, she promised. I won't let her win. The next day, I found an unexpected ally. Mr. Endra, my science teacher, pulled me aside after class. I saw what happened in the hallway yesterday, he said quietly. Ms. Taylor berating you for your tics. That's not acceptable. Relief flooded through me. Finally, another adult who understood. Would you be willing to document these incidents? I asked hopefully. He nodded. I'll keep a record of everything I witness. You're a good student. You don't deserve this treatment. For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of hope. But Ms. Taylor was about to escalate things beyond anything I could have imagined. The following week started with a calculated move from Ms. Taylor. She walked into class carrying a stack of papers and announced a surprise essay assignment worth 30% of our final grade. The topic was personal challenges and growth, due in 2 days. Remember, she said, her eyes finding mine. Plagiarism will result in automatic failure. I threw myself into the essay, writing about living with Tourette's and finding strength through adversity. I had Mom proofread it 3 times. I saved multiple copies on different devices. I even took photos of each page with timestamps. When I submitted it, Ms. Taylor smiled sweetly and placed it in her desk drawer. Something in her expression made my skin crawl. 3 days later, she returned everyone's essays except mine. After class, I approached her desk. Where's my essay? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked up with mock confusion. What essay? You never submitted anything. My heart pounded. Yes, I did. You put it in your drawer right there. I think you're confused, she said, opening the drawer to reveal it was empty. Perhaps your condition is affecting your memory? I pulled out my phone, showing her the time-stamped photos. Her smile faltered for just a second before returning. Photos can be doctored. Without the actual essay, I have no choice but to give you a 0. That evening, I called the first name on Mrs. McBenjamin's list. Sarah answered on the 3rd ring. Her voice was hesitant when I explained who I was and why I was calling. Ms. Taylor made my junior year hell, she said quietly. I have ADH, and she constantly humiliated me for it. My parents complained, but suddenly all the documentation vanished. The principal said without proof there was nothing they could do. The second name, Marcus, had a similar story. He'd struggled with dyslexia, and Ms. Taylor had failed him despite his accommodations. His family ended up moving to another district. The third person, Jamie, was the most revealing. She didn't just target me, Jamie explained. She went after my younger sister too when she got to 9th grade. It's like she keeps a list of families to torment. I started connecting dots. Ms. Taylor wasn't just cruel, she was systematic. She knew exactly how to push boundaries without leaving evidence. The next day, I arrived at school to find my locker door slightly ajar. Inside, tucked between my textbooks, was a copy of an answer key for Ms. Taylor's upcoming test. My blood ran cold. This was a setup. I immediately went to Mr. Endra and showed him what I'd found. He took photos of everything and wrote a detailed report about the discovery. We turned it into the office together, explaining the situation. But during English class, Ms. Taylor made her move. Halfway through the period, she suddenly stopped teaching and walked to my desk. Empty your backpack, she commanded. What? Why? Now. With shaking hands, I unzipped my bag. She reached in and pulled out another copy of the test answers, different from the one I'd found in my locker. The class gasped. Cheating is grounds for expulsion, she announced triumphantly. Principal's office. Now. Mr. Endra must have heard the commotion because he appeared in the doorway. I'll accompany the student, he said firmly. There are some things the principal needs to know. In the principal's office, Mr. Endra presented his documentation about the planted evidence in my locker. The principal looked uncomfortable but sided with Ms. Taylor. The evidence was found in the student's possession, he said. That's all that matters. I felt the walls closing in. My tics were getting worse from the stress, and I could barely sit still. Mom arrived within minutes, furious and ready to fight. That night, we had an emergency family meeting. Mom had been researching education advocates and found one who specialized in disability discrimination. Her name was Ms. Alexandra Chen, and she agreed to meet with us the next day. Ms. Chen was sharp and thorough. She reviewed all our documentation and immediately spotted irregularities. These accommodation forms, she said, pointing to copies from my file. They've been altered. Look at the dates and signatures. Someone's been modifying them after the fact. We compared them to our original copies at home. Sure enough, key accommodations had been removed or changed. My extra time for tests had been crossed out. My permission to step out during tick episodes had been modified to only with teacher approval. This is document fraud, Ms. Chen said. We need to secure all original records immediately. But when we requested my complete file from the school, we were told several documents were missing. The secretary seemed nervous, glancing toward Ms. Taylor's classroom as she spoke. Over the next few days, my situation at school became unbearable. Other teachers started treating me differently, and I overheard Ms. Taylor in the teacher's lounge. The poor thing, she was saying. Clearly the stress is too much. Some students just aren't cut out for mainstream education. There are special facilities that could better meet those needs. My blood ran cold. She was trying to get me removed from regular school entirely. That afternoon, Mrs. McBenjamin pulled me aside. She looked exhausted and worried. I've been placed on administrative leave, she whispered. They say it's for a review of counseling practices, but I know it's because I've been helping you. This is my fault, I said, guilt washing over me. No, she said firmly. This is about doing what's right, but be careful. Ms. Taylor has connections you don't know about. That weekend, Mom and I spent hours organizing evidence. We created multiple copies of everything, storing them in different locations. I reached out to Sarah, Marcus, and Jamie again, and they agreed to provide written statements. On Monday, I walked into English class to find Ms. Taylor had rearranged the seating. My new spot was in the back corner, isolated from other students. A small camera had been installed pointing directly at my desk. For everyone's safety, Ms. Taylor explained to the class, we need to monitor potentially disruptive behavior. The humiliation burned, but I kept recording. Every class, every interaction, everything went into my evidence file. Then Ms. Taylor made a crucial mistake. During a parent-teacher conference, she handed Mom a stack of brochures for residential treatment facilities. One was notorious for its harsh methods and lack of proper medical care. I really think this would be best, Ms. Taylor said with fake concern. They specialize in difficult cases. Mom's hands shook as she flipped through the brochures. I recorded the entire conversation on my phone from outside the door. That night, I did some research on Ms. Taylor. Social media revealed something interesting. She had a son at an expensive private school where she volunteered as a special needs advocate. Her bio bragged about her experience helping challenged students reach their potential. The hypocrisy made me sick. She was building a reputation as an advocate while destroying students like me. I shared this discovery was Sarah, Marcus, and Jamie. They were furious and decided to take action. We created a private group chat to coordinate our efforts. Jamie revealed something crucial. My mom still has emails from Ms. Taylor that she thought she'd deleted. They show her admitting she enjoys breaking certain students. We spent the next week gathering more evidence. Other students started coming forward quietly, sharing their own experiences. A pattern emerged. Ms. Taylor specifically targeted students with disabilities, especially those whose conditions were invisible or misunderstood. Then came the school board meeting. Parents had the right to speak during public comment, and several families signed up. Mom and I prepared a presentation with all our evidence. But the morning of the meeting, I woke up to find my laptop missing. All my evidence files gone. Mom's computer had been wiped clean overnight. Even our cloud backups had been deleted. Panic set in until I remembered. Mr. Endra had copies of everything. I texted him frantically, and he confirmed he still had all the files safely stored. At the school board meeting, the room was packed. Ms. Taylor sat in the front row, looking confident. She kept glancing at her phone and smiling. When it was our turn to speak, Mom approached the microphone. But before she could start, Ms. Taylor stood up. "I'd like to present some evidence of my own," she announced, holding up a flash drive. "These are recordings of this student's behavior in my class." The board allowed her to play the audio, but what came through the speakers wasn't what actually happened. The recordings had been edited, spliced together to make it sound like I was constantly disrupting class and threatening other students. "This is fake!" I shouted, my tics exploding from the stress. "She edited those recordings." Ms. Taylor shook her head sadly. "This is exactly the kind of outburst I deal with daily. The child needs help. I'm not qualified to provide." Just when it seemed hopeless, the door burst open. Sarah, Marcus, and Jamie walked in with their parents. They'd driven from different cities to be here. "We have evidence too," Sarah announced. "Real evidence." They presented their own recordings, emails, and documents. Jamie's mom had printed the emails where Ms. Taylor admitted to enjoying making students suffer. The board members' expressions shifted from skepticism to concern. Then Mr. Endra stood up. "I've been documenting Ms. Taylor's behavior for months," he said, presenting a thick folder. "This includes original documents that were later altered in the student's official file." The room erupted in murmurs. Ms. Taylor's confident expression cracked, but the biggest shock came when Mrs. McBenjamin entered. She wasn't supposed to be there during her leave, but she looked determined. "I have something the board needs to see," she said, holding up her own flash drive. Security footage from the hallway cameras that was supposedly deleted. The footage showed Ms. Taylor taking papers from my locker, planting the test answers, and later entering the main office after hours. Another clip showed her at a computer, accessing student files she had no authorization to view. Ms. Taylor stood up abruptly. "This is a witch hunt. I've dedicated my life to education." "Sit down, Ms. Taylor," the board president said sternly. "We need to review all of this evidence." Ms. Chen, our advocate, presented her final piece. "I've discovered Ms. Taylor never completed the state-required training for working with students with disabilities. She's been signing off on accommodation plans she's not qualified to assess. Furthermore, funds allocated for disability resources in her classroom have been redirected to other purposes." She showed bank records indicating Ms. Taylor had been using the special education budget to purchase supplies for the private school where she volunteered. The board called for an immediate recess. Parents were talking animatedly, and several more stood up to share their own experiences with Ms. Taylor. The pattern of abuse was undeniable. When the board reconvened, their decision was swift. Ms. Taylor was suspended immediately pending a full investigation. They also voted to review all student records from her classes over the past 5 years and to contact families who had filed complaints that were dismissed. Ms. Taylor tried to leave quietly, but parents blocked her path, not physically, but with their words and stories. Student after student came forward, emboldened by our courage. "You told me I was too stupid to learn," one said. "You made me hate school," said another. "You nearly drove me to hurt myself," a third added quietly. Ms. Taylor's face had gone white. For the first time, she seemed to realize the magnitude of what she'd done. The investigation that followed was thorough. Investigators found years of forged documents, misused funds, and a clear pattern of discrimination. Ms. Taylor had kept notes rating students by how much she could break them. Criminal charges were filed for fraud, forgery, and abuse of position. Her teaching license was revoked permanently. The private school where she volunteered banned her from campus. During the legal proceedings, more evidence surfaced. Ms. Taylor had been moved between 3 different schools over her career, each time after complaints that were quietly buried. Our district was just the latest in a long pattern. She was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to community service and restitution. She had to pay back all the misused funds and contribute to a scholarship program for students with disabilities. The school district implemented new policies, including mandatory training for all teachers on disability accommodation, regular audits of student files, and a new complaint system that couldn't be buried by individual administrators. I finished the year with proper accommodations and a new English teacher who actually understood education. My grades recovered, and I even won an essay contest about advocacy and perseverance. At graduation, I gave a speech about finding your voice even when others try to silence it. Sarah, Marcus, and Jamie were in the audience, cheering me on. We'd stayed in touch, supporting each other through the aftermath. Mrs. McBenjamin returned to work and was promoted to head of student services. Mr. Endra received a commendation for his courage in documenting abuse. The principal, who had dismissed our concerns, quietly retired. I started a support group for students with Tourette's and other neurological conditions. We meet monthly to share experiences and strategies. Sometimes parents attend, learning how to advocate for their children. Ms. Taylor's house went up for sale. I heard she moved to another state, but her reputation followed her. No school district would hire her. She ended up working in a call center, far from any classroom. Looking back, I learned that standing up to abuse isn't easy, but it's necessary. One voice might be dismissed, but many voices together can't be ignored. Ms. Taylor thought my Tourette's made me weak, an easy target. She was wrong. Now I'm in college, studying special education. I want to be the teacher I needed when I was struggling. My tics are still part of me, but they don't define my limits. Ms. Taylor tried to convince me I'd never amount to anything. Instead, her cruelty forged me into someone who fights for others who can't fight for themselves. The support group has grown beyond our town. We have online meetings with students from across the country. Some are dealing with their own Ms. Taylors. We help them document, advocate, and survive. Every so often, I get a message from a student who says our story gave them courage to speak up. That makes everything we went through worth it. Ms. Taylor wanted to break us. Instead, she created an army of advocates. My mom framed the letter of apology from the school district. Next to it hangs my college acceptance letter and a photo from the support group's first meeting. These reminders show how far we've come. The last I heard, Ms. Taylor was still paying restitution. Every month, her payments fund scholarships for students with disabilities. It's poetic justice that her cruelty now helps the very students she tried to destroy. I still have tics. They're part of who I am, but I no longer hide them or feel ashamed. In my classroom, when I'm student teaching, I explain my Tourette's matter-of-factly. The kids accept it without question. That's the world I'm helping to build, one where differences are understood, not mocked. Sometimes I wonder if Ms. Taylor ever truly understood the damage she caused. Part of me hopes she did, that she learned and changed. But mostly, I focus on the positive changes that came from our fight. New policies, better training, and most importantly, a community of support for students who need it. That's the real victory. Not just that we stopped one bad teacher, but that we created lasting change. Ms. Taylor thought she could break us. Instead, we broke the system that allowed her to hurt students for so long, and that's something worth celebrating. The board members huddled together, whispering urgently, while Ms. Taylor stood frozen at the front of the room. Her hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. The security footage continued playing on the screen behind her, showing frame after frame of her accessing restricted files. "Turn that off," off, she hissed at the tech operator, but he just shrugged and looked to the board president for direction. More parents began standing up, sharing stories about their children. A father described how his daughter with autism had been forced to sit in the hallway during tests because Ms. Taylor claimed her stimming was distracting. A mother explained how her son's dysgraphia accommodations mysteriously vanished from his file after Ms. Taylor became his teacher. The board president finally banged his gavel. We're calling an emergency executive session. Everyone please remain seated. Ms. Taylor's phone buzzed repeatedly on the table. She grabbed it, her face growing paler with each message she read. I caught a glimpse of the screen. Other teachers were texting her warnings about investigators arriving at the school. 20 minutes later, the board members filed back in. Their faces were grim. The president cleared his throat. Effective immediately, Ms. Taylor is suspended without pay pending a full investigation. All her classes will be covered by substitute teachers starting tomorrow. Ms. Taylor shot to her feet. You can't do this based on accusations from troubled children. These aren't just accusations, the president replied firmly. The evidence presented tonight, particularly the security footage and financial records, warrants immediate action. 2 security officers entered the room. Ms. Taylor's face twisted with rage as she realized they were there for her. I'll need your classroom keys and district ID, one officer said calmly. She fumbled in her purse, hands shaking. As she handed over the items, she turned to glare at me. This isn't over, she mouthed silently. The officers escorted her out while the room erupted in conversation. Parents were exchanging phone numbers, planning to coordinate their efforts. Sarah, Marcus, and Jamie surrounded me, all talking at once. We did it, Sarah kept saying, tears streaming down her face. We actually did it. Ms. Chen approached our group. This is just the beginning. The investigation will be thorough, and they'll need all of you to provide formal statements. Over the next few days, the school transformed. Investigators set up in the main office, interviewing students and reviewing records. They discovered Ms. Taylor had been falsifying attendance records to make it appear that students with disabilities were absent more often than they actually were. I gave my formal statement in a small conference room with Mom and Miss Chen present. The investigator, a kind woman named Ms. Rodriguez, recorded everything while I described each incident in detail. My tics were acting up from the stress, but she waited patiently each time I needed to pause. She kept a notebook, I told Ms. Rodriguez. I saw it once when she left her desk drawer open. It had student names with ratings next to them. Ms. Rodriguez made a note. We'll search for that. Thank you for being so thorough. The investigation expanded when they found Ms. Taylor's notebook hidden behind textbooks in her classroom closet. Inside were detailed notes about students spanning back years, with cruel nicknames and strategies for breaking each one. My name was there, labeled Dog Boy, with notes about triggering my vocal tics. More victims came forward. A girl from 5 years ago contacted the district, explaining how Ms. Taylor had convinced her parents she needed psychiatric hospitalization for her ADHD. A boy who graduated 3 years prior revealed Ms. Taylor had altered his IEP without authorization, removing crucial accommodations. The financial investigation uncovered something even worse. Ms. Taylor had been billing the district for specialized equipment and software for students with disabilities, then returning the items for cash refunds. The money went straight into her personal account. Over her career, she'd stolen nearly $40,000 meant for vulnerable students. Local news picked up the story. Reporters gathered outside the school, interviewing parents and students. Mom declined all interview requests, keeping me away from the cameras. This isn't about fame, she said. It's about justice. Ms. Taylor hired an expensive lawyer who tried to paint her as a dedicated teacher being persecuted by difficult students, but the evidence was overwhelming. When forensic analysts examined her district computer, they found she'd been accessing and modifying student records for years, always careful to cover her tracks. The criminal case moved forward. Ms. Taylor was charged with embezzlement, fraud, and multiple counts of official misconduct. Her teaching license was permanently revoked by the State Board of Education. The private school where she volunteered immediately terminated their relationship with her. During this time, I struggled to keep up with schoolwork. The substitute teacher for English was nice but overwhelmed. Other students who'd been too scared to speak up before started sharing their own stories about Ms. Taylor. Our classroom became an informal support group. One morning, I arrived at school to find Ms. Taylor in the parking lot. She wasn't supposed to be there. Part of her suspension included staying away from school property. She approached me quickly, her eyes wild. You ruined my life, she spat. Do you understand what you've done? My son has to change schools because of you. I backed away, my tics firing rapidly. Other students noticed and started recording with their phones. A security guard rushed over. Ma'am, you need to leave immediately, he said, positioning himself between us. I'm talking to my student, Ms. Taylor snapped. Former student, I managed to say through my tics. And you're violating your suspension. The security guard called for backup, while Ms. Taylor continued ranting about how ungrateful we all were, how she dedicated her life to education. Parents dropping off their kids stopped to watch. Someone must have called 911 because police sirens wailed in the distance. Ms. Taylor realized her mistake too late. As police officers arrived, she tried to walk calmly to her car, but they stopped her. Violating the terms of her suspension was a serious offense. They arrested her right there in the parking lot while dozens of students and parents watched. That incident added new charges to her case. Her lawyer tried to argue she was under emotional distress, but the judge wasn't sympathetic. Her bail was revoked, and she spent the next several months in county jail awaiting trial. The district brought in Dr. Patricia Williams, a specialist in inclusive education, to take over Ms. Taylor's classes permanently. On her first day, she gathered all of us together. I know you've been through a traumatic experience, she said gently. My classroom will be a safe space for everyone. Your accommodations will be honored, your differences celebrated. She meant it. Under Dr. Williams, English became my favorite class again. She introduced us to authors with disabilities, taught us about disability rights history, and created an environment where everyone felt valued. The trial date approached. The prosecutor met with all the victims and their families, preparing us for testimony. It was daunting, but we supported each other. Sarah, Marcus, Jamie, and I created a group chat called Taylor Survivors, where we shared encouragement and coping strategies. When the trial began, the courtroom was packed. Ms. Taylor sat at the defendant's table in a gray suit, looking smaller than I remembered. Her lawyer tried various defenses. Stress, dedication taken too far, misunderstanding of district policies. None of it stuck. I testified on the third day. My tics were intense from anxiety, but the judge was patient. I described the headphone incident, the systematic grade manipulation, the plan to test answers. The prosecutor introduced my medical records showing the concussion I'd sustained. Sarah testified about her ADHD being weaponized against her. Marcus explained how Ms. Taylor had told him dyslexia was just laziness. Jamie's mother read the emails where Ms. Taylor bragged about making students cry. The financial evidence was particularly damning. Prosecutors showed receipt after receipt for equipment that was never given to students. They presented Ms. Taylor's bank records showing large cash deposits matching the refund amounts. Ms. Taylor took the stand in her own defense. She claimed everything was a misunderstanding, that she was trying to prepare us for a harsh world. But under cross-examination, her story fell apart. She couldn't explain the altered documents, the stolen money, or the security footage. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. Ms. Taylor stood motionless as the verdict was read, her lawyer's hand on her shoulder. In the gallery, parents and former students quietly cried, some from relief, others from remembering their pain. Sentencing came 2 months later. The judge reviewed victim impact statements from dozens of students spanning Ms. Taylor's entire career. He noted the particular cruelty of targeting children with disabilities, the breach of trust, and the financial theft from programs meant to help vulnerable students. You were entrusted with shaping young minds, the judge said sternly. Instead, you chose to harm those who most needed support. Your actions were calculated, cruel, and criminal. He sentenced her to 5 years in prison, followed by 10 years of probation. She was ordered to pay full restitution for the stolen funds plus damages to affected families. She would never be allowed to work with children again. As court officers led Ms. Taylor away in handcuffs, she looked back at the gallery. Our eyes met for a moment. I expected to see hatred, but instead saw something else. Maybe regret, maybe just defeat. Then she was gone. Outside the courthouse, families hugged and cried. Local disability advocacy groups had gathered to support us. Reporters asked for comments, but most of us just wanted to go home and process what had happened. The school district used our case to implement sweeping reforms. They established an independent review board for accommodation plans, created anonymous reporting systems for discrimination, and mandated extensive training for all staff on disability laws and inclusive practices. Dr. Williams helped establish a peer mentorship program where older students with disabilities could support younger ones. I volunteered as a mentor, sharing my experiences and coping strategies with kids who reminded me of my younger self. My grades recovered fully. Colleges that had seemed out of reach became possibilities again. I wrote my application essays about advocacy and resilience, about finding strength in community and standing up for what's right. Sarah went on to study psychology, inspired to help kids with ADH. Marcus became a reading specialist, determined to support students with dyslexia. Jamie pursued disability law, wanting to protect others from discrimination. The restitution money was used to create a scholarship fund for students with disabilities. Every year, it helps kids afford assistive technology, tutoring, and college expenses. Ms. Taylor's payments from prison wages barely made a dent, but the district supplemented it to ensure the fund could make a real difference. I graduated with honors, giving a speech about the power of speaking up. In the audience sat my mom, Mrs. McBenjamin, Mr. Endra, Dr. Williams, and dozens of families who'd fought alongside us. My tics punctuated the speech, but nobody minded. If anything, they made my message more powerful. College brought new challenges, but also new freedoms. I studied special education with a focus on neurodiversity. My tics were just part of who I was, no longer something to hide or be ashamed of. I found my people, others who understood that different doesn't mean less than. During my senior year, I returned to my old high school for student teaching. Dr. Williams was still there, now department head. She'd transformed the English program into a model of inclusive education. Walking those familiar hallways felt surreal, but empowering. I taught a unit on self-advocacy to freshmen. When I explained my Tourette's on the first day, several students approached me afterward. One had ADH, another autism, a third struggled with anxiety. They saw themselves in me, saw possibility instead of limitation. The old English classroom had been completely redesigned. Where Mr. Taylor's desk once stood like a fortress, Dr. Williams had created a collaborative space with flexible seating and sensory tools. The walls displayed student work, celebrating diverse perspectives and experiences. One afternoon, while grading papers, I found an essay that stopped me cold. A student wrote about feeling different, about teachers who didn't understand, about wanting to disappear. I recognized that pain, that fear. But this time, I was in a position to help. I pulled the student aside after class, told them about resources and support available. I shared a bit of my own story, careful not to overwhelm them. They left with hope in their eyes and a list of people who could help. That night, I updated the Taylor Survivors group chat. We'd all gone different directions, but stayed connected. Sarah was finishing her doctorate, Marcus had opened a learning center, Jamie had just won a major disability rights case. We transformed our trauma into purpose. Mom called to check in, as she did every week. She told me how proud she was, how far we'd come from that terrifying day in the hospital. In the background, I heard her organizing files. She'd become an advocate herself, helping other parents navigate the special education system. I thought about Ms. Taylor sometimes, wondered if prison had changed her perspective. Part of me hoped she'd gained understanding, maybe even remorse. But mostly, I focused on the positive changes her actions had inadvertently sparked. The scholarship fund had grown beyond our district. Other schools started similar programs, inspired by our story. Thousands of students with disabilities were getting support that might not have existed without our fight for justice. My tics evolved over the years, but never disappeared. They were part of my neurology, my identity. In my classroom, they became teaching moments about acceptance and adaptation. Students learned that everyone has challenges, visible or invisible, and that's okay. As I prepared for my own classroom after graduation, I kept a photo on my desk from that first school board meeting. It showed a scared kid with bandages on their head, surrounded by people ready to fight for what's right. That kid had no idea they'd become a teacher, an advocate, a voice for others. The cycle of harm Ms. Taylor perpetuated for years had ended. In its place grew understanding, support, and systemic change. She tried to convince me I'd never amount to anything. Instead, her cruelty catalyzed a movement that helped countless students believe in their own worth. My first year teaching brought challenges and triumphs. Students with disabilities gravitated toward my classroom, knowing they'd be understood. Parents sought my advice. Administrators consulted me on accommodation plans. I became what I'd needed, an educator who saw potential where others saw problems. The Taylor Survivors still meet annually. We gather to remember how far we've come and plan ways to help others. Our group has grown to include students from other districts who faced similar discrimination. Together, we're stronger than any one teacher's cruelty. Sometimes new teachers ask me why I chose special education. I tell them about Ms. Taylor, about the headphones in the hospital, about a community that refused to let injustice stand. But mostly, I tell them about the students who deserve better, who need educators willing to see their strengths. My classroom rules are simple: respect for all, accommodations without shame, and celebration of neurodiversity. Where Ms. Taylor saw weakness to exploit, I see strength to nurture. Where she created fear, I foster belonging. Her legacy of harm became my blueprint for healing. Students flourish when they're understood. The kid with Tourette's who was told they'd amount to nothing, they're teaching the next generation that different brains have value, that advocacy creates change, and that no teacher's cruelty can define a student's worth.